It's Wednesday, July 23rd, 2014, and you're listening to the Armchair Atheism podcast. I'm your host, Taylor Carr, and today I'm pleased to bring you an interview with Graham Oppy, an atheist philosopher who has published extensively on arguments for and against the existence of God, and is regarded by a number of atheists and even theists as one of the big guns in philosophical criticism of religion. We'll be discussing the philosophy of religion along with Dr. Oppy's newest book, arguing for a reinvention of the discipline. That said, hope you enjoy the interview. Graham Oppy is professor of philosophy at Monash University, associate editor of the Australasian Journal of Philosophy, and the author of several books and published articles in the area of philosophy of religion, including Ontological Arguments and Belief in God, Philosophical Perspectives on Infinity, and Arguing About Gods. Graham, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
How are things in your corner of the globe over there?
Well, it's midwinter, so cooler than the rest of the year, I think I could say.
So you are an atheist philosopher of religion, and I know to some people that might kind of sound like you're a godless monk, so I guess to begin with, if you could start off with explaining what the philosophy of religion is, or what it's been historically, and maybe also why atheists or non-theists would care about a subject like that.
Okay, so maybe I should start by saying something about what philosophy is, because that helps to explain what philosophy of religion is. So I think of philosophy, philosophical questions as being, at a time, as being the questions that we don't know how to answer in a way that gets broad agreement. Perhaps they're questions of a kind, and we don't know how to answer those kinds of questions in a way that gets broad agreement. So most disciplines start off as philosophy, I think. For example, for a long time, people thought that people couldn't agree about the composition of the stars, what the stars are made of. As recently as the 1820s, there were people who said that we could never know, but for thousands of years, people had speculated about what the stars might be. Then in the 1830s, methods were discovered that enable us to determine exactly what the stars are made of. And at that point, the question just became a standard scientific question for astrophysics and astrochemistry. And I think that lots of disciplines go like that. Philosophy is concerned with the bits where we don't know how to approach the questions. So for any discipline, there are things on the borderline of the discipline. So questions that are sort of on the borderline of physics, but we're not really sure if they're physical questions or not. We're not sure if physics will be able to answer them. We don't know whether current physics can answer them or not. And so you get people who do philosophy of physics. I think of philosophy of religion as being like that. So there's a bunch of questions about religion that we currently don't really know how to answer. At any rate, we don't know how to answer them in a way that gets broad-scale agreement. And by that I mean something like we get agreement amongst kind of properly informed people across a wide range of cultures. So take physics, for example. The answers that you get to physical questions aren't different in Pakistan or Russia from what they are in the United States or Australia. What you would want from religion, for religion, would be something similar, answers to questions about religion where you get sort of broad agreement in different cultures. Okay, so that's what I think philosophy of religion is. And I think it's kind of obvious why atheists should care about it, because religion's a very significant phenomenon. It's clearly important in motivation of behaviour, and religious beliefs explain lots of things that people do. I think that everybody should be interested in understanding religion, and in particular in questions that arise where we don't currently understand religion very well, where there are questions that we're not even sure how to approach, how to secure solid agreed answers on about religion.
So, to what extent then, if you do, would you differentiate this from something like theology or especially apologetics? Do you see there as being some overlap there, or is it very distinct differences between those?
I think that there are various parts of philosophy of religion. So, just because there are different areas of religion where there are questions that we don't know yet how to secure answers on. So take what has been a much discussed question about the existence of God. That's clearly a question in philosophy of religion. It's not, in my view, the most important question, but it's a question in philosophy of religion. And it's obviously related to questions in theology and apologetics. That is, people who see themselves as engaged in theology or engaged in apologetics think that they've got something to say on the question of God's existence. But my interest, and what I think the interest of philosophy of religion properly construed is there a way of arriving at an answer to this question that's going to be broadly acceptable, right, to at least to suitably informed people.
So that kind of segues into the next question I had, which is, what for you were your personal experiences or things that happened in your life that motivated you to study and make a career in a field like this, especially as an atheist?
Okay, so I really have to divide this question in two, because I think that making a career in the philosophy of religion was something of an accident. When I went to graduate school, I wrote a PhD in philosophy of language, and I think when I left graduate school, I kind of expected that in my career I would be doing stuff in philosophy of science, philosophy of language, metaphysics, epistemology. I wasn't thinking at that point that I would end up being a philosopher of religion. There were just a couple of accidental things. The first thing I did after I left graduate school was to take a casual job teaching philosophy of religion. So I had 6 months sort of immersed in the philosophy of religion literature. And then a couple of years after that, I got a postdoc to write a book on ontological arguments. And by the time I'd finished writing that book, I think the kind of direction of my career had been sort of fixed. So that was accidental. What motivated me to study philosophy of religion? For a very long time, I've been interested in arguments about the existence of God. So it's a topic I got interested in quite early in high school. And the very first paper I wrote in Philosophy 101 was actually a paper on ontological argument, on Descartes' ontological argument. So I guess it's just there's those kinds of questions I just found intrinsically interesting.
I can't say there were probably many people in my Philosophy 101 class who understood, let alone would have written on the ontological argument.
So I don't think that the things that I was interested in, and I spent a lot of my career thinking about arguments about the existence of God, I don't think of that as being sort of all there is to philosophy of religion by any means. It's a part of philosophy of religion that I find particularly interesting, but that might very well be a kind of minority interest.
All right, well, one of the things that has been kind of a big issue since it came out is the Phil Papers survey that reveals the stark contrast between the number of, I guess you could say the ratio of theists to atheists between philosophy and philosophy of religion. That being that there's way more, it's almost like a direct, from the figures that I've seen, it's almost a direct inversion. There's a lot more theists in the philosophy of religion than atheists, and vice versa. There's a lot more atheists in philosophy in general than there is theists. So I guess what do you think the current state of the discipline is, and has it changed in your view from what it has been or what you've known of it historically?
I think that it's a very recent discipline, actually, philosophy of religion. So religious studies certainly is. Religious studies has only been around for 50 years or so as a discipline in universities. And of course, universities themselves have only been around for a fairly short period of time. There were maybe 700 or 800 years in the case of universities like Oxford and Paris, but as a kind of big scale feature of Western society, universities have only been around for 150 years or so, a couple of hundred years. Philosophy of religion as a discipline, I would think, probably doesn't date much earlier than the Second World War. If you looked around and before that and you asked how many people self-identified as philosophers of religion, you would find very few. Of course, there were people who talked about topics that are of interest in philosophy of religion. That's been going on since the beginning of philosophy. But the idea of it being a discipline seems to me to be quite a recent thing. Has it changed very much? I guess then if you think about that short time frame, it probably hasn't changed very much. I would think that most of the people who've done philosophy of religion over the past 50 years have been theists. There haven't, or if not theists, though most of them have been theists, if not theists, people who have religion of one kind or another. And there's just a small number of atheists and other ne'er-do-wells who've been interested in arguing with them about various points.
Yeah, I know that I'm not sure when exactly it was published, but Paul Draper and Ryan Nichols published a paper called Diagnosing Bias in Philosophy of Religion that has some interesting conclusions that they've drawn. And I think that kind of ties in nicely to your newest book that you've recently published, Reinventing Philosophy of Religion, which makes the case for a kind of reform of the discipline. And I was wondering if you could give some examples of what you think philosophy of religion should be doing that it isn't doing, as well as if you can think of them examples of what you believe it's currently doing right.
Okay, so the biggest thing about philosophy of religion as it's been practiced in the West is that it's had an extremely narrow focus. It hasn't really been philosophy of religion. It's been philosophy of Christianity or particular Christian sect with a very great emphasis on theism and considerations about God. There's amongst Christian philosophers, there's been an attempt to broaden out philosophy of religion so that it takes in a lot of other aspects of Christianity and Christian teaching other than just questions about the existence of God. That's something that's happened in the last 30 years. But there hasn't really been a corresponding widening of focus to take in all the other religions of the world. And it seems to me that the most interesting questions in philosophy of religion are general questions about religion, not questions about the doctrines of particular religions. So I would like to see philosophy of religion having a global focus and addressing questions that apply to the phenomenon of religion quite generally, rather than being tied to particular religions, where philosophy of religion often, as you kind of alluded to earlier, gets associated with apologetics or particular kinds of theology. What do I think that it's currently doing right? Well, there's nothing wrong with lots of the stuff that's done. So there's quite interesting arguments about the existence of God that have been examined in considerable detail in recent years, and that work seems to be perfectly fine to me. There's also been quite a bit of interesting work done on attributes of God as God's conceived in Abrahamic religions, or particular parts of the Abrahamic religions, particular denominations of Christianity or particular branches of Islam or particular branches of Judaism. But so there's been interesting work done, historical work, particularly I think on medieval theology and philosophy, some of which has interesting applications to current discussions, not just in philosophy of religion, but metaphysics, epistemology, and elsewhere.
So, do you have any examples, I guess? It sounds like what you're arguing for is more of a broadening, I guess, of the discipline. What do you think, if there's anything that it should be doing that it isn't currently doing?
Something... Okay, well, no, the broadening means that there's lots of stuff that it isn't doing that it should be doing, because there's all of these questions in Hindu philosophy of religion or Buddhist philosophy of religion that simply aren't being addressed, and lots of them are very interesting questions. It's not that I think that everything that's going on is being done well either. I think that there are serious misunderstandings about what arguments can be used to do that underlie a lot of discussion in contemporary philosophy of religion. So this is a topic that I take up a little bit in Reinventing Philosophy of Religion, but that I've been writing a lot more about elsewhere. So I also think that there are local areas of practice in philosophy of religion that are going rather seriously wrong. But that's a more controversial part of my view, and it's a view that I've arrived at after sort of reflecting on the work that I've done in the last 20 years or so on arguments about the existence of God.
Well, it's interesting that your book has been released at the time that it has, because Peter Boghossian, author of A Manual for Creating Atheists, has recently stirred up some controversy for tweeting that publishing in the philosophy of religion should, quote, disqualify one from sitting at the adult table. And Jerry Coyne kind of followed suit and dismissed the field as garbage. And it seems like a lot of the criticism that's being directed at the discipline these days is primarily concerned with what you've already brought up as basically the concept of God or apologetics or natural theology. But as you've already alluded to, this isn't all that philosophy of religion is about. Do you think that there are things worth focusing on other than that can be done, I guess, better in philosophy of religion than they could in maybe anthropology or history? Like, for example, studying, you brought up the Hindu beliefs, and I know they have some pretty interesting views in some of those sects about the Vedas and certain kind of non-theistic conceptions of the divine. Is that sort of the kind of study that you'd like to see more of in the philosophy of religion?
I'd certainly like to see more of that. I'd also like to see more discussion that's informed by recent developments in anthropology and history and so on. I think that philosophy has to stay in contact with the various surrounding disciplines. I thought I should say something before we come back to this about the comments by Boghossian and Coyne. Their views, the views that they're expressing, seem to me to be themselves views in philosophy of religion. Right? The idea that I assume that Coyne means that God is a non-existent construct. Right? When he talks about philosophy, a non-existent construct, that's just a position in philosophy of religion. There are, after all, plenty of these days. There are, well, I was going to say plenty, but there's certainly quite a few philosophers of religion who think that God doesn't exist. Well,
and the thing that I guess when I first read those articles, my reaction was Well, I mean, there's people in ethics who are moral non-cognitivists who don't think ethical language is propositional, that it has, any truth value, but at least I don't hear about many of them calling for the downfall of ethics, so it seems a little bit like there's maybe too much protest there going on. I don't know.
No, well, that's quite a good example, because all of those people would claim to be moral philosophers. It's just that they take a particular position. And I don't think that there's anything wrong with taking the view that God doesn't exist, and that the teachings of the world's religions, at least let's say their metaphysical and epistemological teachings, are all just wrong. That's a respectable view, but it's certainly not a view that we've managed to secure widespread agreement on amongst all the intelligent people that are out there. There's clearly a lot more work to be done before some kind of consensus about religion and about the questions that are raised in philosophy of religion are going to be agreed on, before there'll be a consensus that we arrive at.
Yeah, it does seem like a little bit of putting the cart before the horse. I was actually contacting Keith Parsons, another, I guess, former philosopher of religion now, because he had announced he was leaving that field I think 4 years ago or so.
I don't think he's actually left, though. Exactly.
Yeah, he seems like he still has some strongly held opinions on that, but he kind of has a similar view to it, sounds like, what you're advocating, which is that there are other things worth studying, just like, I guess to use that analogy again with non-cognitivists, just like they see maybe ethical language as still being interesting and something worth studying, it seems like there's still things, like especially with, I guess you could say, just the sacred or religious experience, things that are worth looking at. And just as there's things that, I mean, even atheists have their abstractions that they kind of hold to, like love, beauty, and value and stuff like that are considered worthy of dialogue and study. And even some of them are still kind of influential towards violent and irrational conflicts throughout our world. So I guess, why do you think there is no similar push to marginalize other things like politics or aesthetics or ethics? Or do you think it has to do primarily with the religious issue?
Yeah, this is there's a lot in this question as well. So if you go back to logical positivism and you look at Ayre's little book, Language, Truth and Logic, there's a certain sense in which Ayre was marginalising all of these things, aesthetics, ethics, politics and religion all together. There was a recognition that this didn't work, and in any case, it's sort of obvious that there are things to study in connection with politics and ethics and aesthetics. But it seems to me that it's equally obvious that there are things to study in connection with religion. Maybe you might think that, even if you have the view that believing in the tenets of any religion is just irrational, even if you had that view, a view that seems mistaken to me, but even if you had that view, that wouldn't mean that there wasn't a lot of interesting stuff to study here, because why do people believe these things? What are the consequences of their believing these things? What are the connections between certain kinds of violent conflicts and religion? There's a whole lot of questions about religion that are significant and important, and while answering these questions requires you to draw on a whole lot of things, demography, geography, history, politics, and so on, there'll be a role for philosophy in addressing those questions as well.
Many of the objections that I've seen to philosophy of religion seem to revolve around its social status, as if it kind of gives undue legitimacy to superstition. And the comparison I keep hearing is it's pretty much the same way intelligent design is said to be creationism in a cheap tuxedo. So, I mean, would you agree with this assessment of the situation? Presumably not from what you've already said, but it seems like kind of a bit of a cheap shot because, I mean, isn't intelligent design, at least from what I know of it, there's lots of its claims that seem unfalsifiable and some of its arguments are outright fallacious, and you could make the same argument, I guess, of a lot of the things in religion, but doesn't that seem like too, I guess, broad of a brush to paint the whole field with?
Well, I think so, and I don't think that people would say that, you know, when anthropologists or historians or sociologists study religion, that they're giving undue legitimacy to superstition, right? It's obviously a legitimate field of study to study religion, and you would expect, as in other areas, that study of religion is going to throw up all kinds of questions that are partly or wholly philosophical. I mean, to take one obvious question, there's a question about what religion is and how religion's related to culture and what it is that distinguishes something as religion as opposed to something else. So there's the kind of definitional, conceptual questions about exactly what the object of study is. That's always a kind of philosophical question. I mean, and there are various views that you might have. Maybe you think that in the end, really, it's just a matter for stipulation, that there's sort of no fact of the matter about what religion is, but you can stipulate. Or maybe you think there is a fact of the matter about what religion is. You know, there are various methods for arriving at definitions in philosophy. So that's just one topic, and philosophers can make a contribution because that helps other people. Because if you read in cultural studies or religious studies, or even in fields like sociology and anthropology, if you read works in those fields, they often spend time worrying about what religion is and what it is as an object of study. And they do philosophy often, but they don't do it very well. So in trying to answer that question. So it does seem to me that it's sort of obvious that there's lots of things that you can do in philosophy of religion that are genuine contribution and aren't doing anything like giving legitimacy to superstition.
Yeah, I actually had to write a paper in my comparative religion class that I took on the subject of what religion is, and that was probably one of the hardest things I've had to write, because first of all, there's the question of, you know, do you go with essential definitions or cluster definitions? Then what do you incorporate under all of that? And it seems like either way there's going to be room for debate. So it certainly does seem like that's a question that's well worth at least asking. But I guess some critics would say that could be arguably done under other disciplines like psychology or history or anthropology again. But you've already touched on this a little bit, but can you think of anything maybe specific that you think would be better studied under philosophy? I guess what would be that? I know there's some overlap there, as you already mentioned, but what do you think maybe is best left, for lack of a better term, to the domain of philosophy?
Well, there are things that we don't know, that we don't have any other discipline that we can apply in order to study questions. So in particular, that analysing arguments about the existence of God is clearly something that belongs, at the moment, belongs to philosophy of religion, and perhaps it always will belong to philosophy of religion. We don't have a kind of separate discipline of argument analysis. And I mean, the talking about arguments about the existence of God clearly brings in questions from areas like logic and philosophy of language, which are also at this stage still parts of philosophy. Apart from that, there's the other way to think about this is, okay, so philosophy covers a number of areas where there's clearly a core of stuff that we don't know how to discuss in other ways. So there are questions about metaphysics, questions about epistemology, questions about that fall under logic, philosophy of language, questions that fall under ethics, questions that fall under political philosophy, and so on. And all of these kinds of questions come up in philosophy of religion. And so where those kinds of questions come up in philosophy of religion, it seems to me that it's quite proper that their discussion falls under that banner. Not that they can't be informed by, as I said before, by a whole lot of other disciplines, but they're still questions that people with philosophical training have some advantage in trying to answer them because of the training that they've had. So that's my answer to that question.
Right. At least from my admittedly amateur and limited time studying philosophy, I've also noticed that there certainly seems to be some argument, even among philosophers, about what philosophy should properly be doing. And even on the other side of the fence, I know there's people like Paul Mosier who proposes his, I think he calls it Christ-shaped philosophy, which is, he wants it to, basically be subservient to the church, it sounds like. So, I don't know. It seems like maybe there's just no pleasing some people because everybody has their own opinions about what philosophy should definitely be doing,
Right. So there are certainly people who think that, for example, take that area of metaphysics, that the only metaphysics worth doing is metaphysics that's really tied to sort of the current cutting edge in physics, right? And the questions that are worth answering have to be questions that are thrown up by the sciences. So there'll be questions on the borderline of physics or chemistry or whatever it is. That's one kind of view. There are people who think that philosophy is a kind of standalone discipline, that there's a whole lot of stuff that you can figure out a priori, that no other disciplines are, inform what you can get from first philosophy. I don't think of philosophy like that. I don't think that philosophy really is a discipline in that sense, that there are substantive claims that still belong to philosophy that have been established in such a way that everybody accepts them or should accept them. My view is more that philosophy buds off disciplines over time as we figure out ways of addressing questions that previously were the only thing we could do was philosophical speculation. I think that philosophical speculation is valuable where partly because of its track record in spinning things off. I can pick almost any discipline. Originally, all there was philosophical answers to the questions posed in that discipline.
That actually brings up something else that I'd heard from on the internet, which, you gotta love that as a source because it has all kinds of stuff. But there does seem to be this feeling among a lot of people I've spoken to that, if we only just based all our beliefs on evidence, we wouldn't have stuff like the philosophy of religion. But does that go to the question of even what evidence is, what counts as the kind of appropriate evidence for something like religious claims? It still seems like even that falls under ideas of philosophy of religion, at least philosophy of language and things of that sort.
Well, take a different example. Say, consider physics, right, where we do think that the establishment of claims has to be based in evidence. So we do theorizing, but it's got to be, It still happens that philosophical questions arise around the edges of physics. And, there's a great physics and philosophy group at Cambridge where there's a lot of interaction between philosophers and physicists discussing those kinds of questions. Now, I don't see why philosophy of religion particularly should be any different from philosophy of physics, right? There's there's a bunch of questions that we don't really know how to make progress on. There's no reason to think that somehow or other we currently have data that we're ignoring that would enable us to answer those questions. Maybe thinking about the questions will suggest data that we might collect that would help us to answer them, but maybe not. I don't think that that is sort of useful to say if only you attended to the data, philosophy of religion would disappear. That just doesn't seem right. Doesn't fit with my conception of what philosophy of religion and philosophy are.
Well, if philosophy of religion is reinvented or at least, improved per your suggestions that you've outlined in the book, how do you foresee it maybe changing things for the better, especially with respect to the presence it has in institutions of higher learning?
Okay, so one difference will be that if it was reinvented as I would like to see it reinvented, would be that it would be much more inclusive. It would consider religion and not just the very narrow scope of certain sects of Christianity, which is really what it's focused on so far. It would also, I think, draw a lot more on empirical work in a whole range of related disciplines. So a lot of philosophy of religion, the way that it's taught at the moment, it really does just proceed pretty much a priori. And I think that it would be much better if it was informed more by other disciplines. But that's just a question about location, really. The distinctively philosophical contribution will be analytical and, I guess, imaginative as well, thinking up possible explanations of things or possible accounts of things. More particularly, I think the treatment of arguments about the existence of God would be very different if my views about how arguments should be analysed were adopted. It seems unlikely to me that that's going to be the case. I think my views are an outlier relative to the views that most people in philosophy of religion have about what arguments can do. And I'm not expecting that that's going to change very quickly.
But it seems like at least a lot of what you've been suggesting is something that I would hope, unless they're maybe very close to other ways of viewing the world, that even a lot of theistic philosophers would get behind, because it does seem like it at least offers the opportunity to maybe come to more of an understanding of how different people in different cultures see the world and think of things.
That's what I would hope. It may be, so, and to go back to something that you mentioned earlier, that if your real motivation is more apologetic or, missionary, then you won't like this thought. And because, although I haven't emphasized this, I do think that an important part of philosophy of religion is the sort of comparing of worldviews, and the worldviews include non-religious worldviews like naturalism. And I think that one very important part of philosophy of religion is to compare religious worldviews with non-religious worldviews and think about the theoretical virtues that attach to each, and to think about whether there's ways that we might weigh them up and determine whether some are more theoretically virtuous than others. Of course, my own view is that naturalism is a particularly virtuous worldview, but that's my opinion. It's certainly not something that I'm expecting to see broad agreement on anytime soon.
Well, what's next on your agenda in the future, then? I know that you had the subtitle for this book is an introduction, so is there going to be more to come on this frontier of reinventing the discipline?
The next thing that I'm working on is a book on naturalism and religion, so it actually fits into the kind of my what we've been talking about, my view about what philosophy of religion should look like. I have a book on divine attributes, which was a companion to Arguing About Gods, which will be out in a few months. And that's really, I think, finishing off the kind of work that I did on arguments about the existence of God. I'm hoping that I'll keep away from that area in the future, but I doubt it because I find it so interesting. But I do want to spend a lot more time thinking about how to weigh naturalistic worldviews against religious worldviews, with a view to arguing that the naturalistic worldviews are better.
Well, that sounds great. I take it that book that you mentioned about the attributes, is that kind of making arguments for incompatible attributes, or is that something more?
It's relevant to that. I mean, I don't directly address the arguments. What I do is I just look at accounts of the attributes and consider things that you might say about the attributes in the face of various of those kinds of incompatibility challenges. But I'm not promoting any of the incompatibility arguments. I'm just assessing the difficulties that they face.
Well, last of all, I just have to ask, since I saw this when I was looking up your CV online, you have an article or a book called The Best Argument, I think, Against God's Existence. Yeah. I'm curious what you think that argument is.
Okay, so this is related to what I was saying before about comparing worldviews. So in that book, I say, think about theism and naturalism thought of as causal, roughly in causal terms. So naturalism says there are none but natural causes involving none but natural entities. And then theism says, no, there's more. There's a supernatural creator and maybe supernatural supporter and maybe involved in other causal ways as well. But on the theistic view, the causal web is much more complicated because they've got all of the naturalistic causes and then they've got a whole lot of additional stuff as well. So speaking roughly, it's clear that naturalism is a simpler view than theism. Naturalism's committed to a whole lot less, fewer entities, fewer kinds of entities, fewer sort of primitive undefined properties and so on. So that's a kind of starting point. Now consider the various things that you might hope to explain, the things that are data to the theories, there being something rather than nothing, the universe apparently being fine-tuned, the existence of consciousness, the existence of moral values, and so on. Consider a whole range of these things. What I argue is that on all of these bits of data, naturalism does at least as well as theism in explaining them. So I go through a whole lot of data, and then I say naturalism was simpler to start with. There's nothing that it doesn't explain at least as well as theism does, so it's the better theory, so you should believe it. So that's what I say is the best argument. I then go on to say that even though I think this is the best argument, it's clear that it faces some difficulties. It's not a compelling argument as it stands. But my aim wasn't to produce a convincing argument. What I wanted to say is, look, this is the best argument that there is. It happens to favour naturalism. We can forget about all of the theistic arguments at this point.
And is this what you're going to flesh out a little bit more in the book that you said you're working on?
To some extent, there'll be a bit more fleshing out in this book. I suspect that there'll be more somewhere further down the track. So the book that I've got in mind is actually going to be much more concerned with addressing certain objections to naturalism. So Plantinga's evolutionary argument against naturalism, Mike Ray's arguments in World Without Design, Plantinga's other arguments in Where the Conflict Really Lies. I'm much more concerned with addressing sort of objections to naturalism. And then maybe the book after that, I'll go back and try to flesh out some more of the details of the argument that's sketched in The Best Argument Against God.
Well, I look forward to reading that when it comes out. It seems like, at least to me, we could always use more philosophical defenses of naturalism for all the stuff that's out there on apologetics for Christian theism.
Well, certainly there is a great imbalance in the materials on both sides in philosophy of religion. This adverts back to what you were saying about the Phil Papers survey. There's a massive amount of stuff that in philosophy of religion that's produced by theists. At least in the West, North America, the UK, and a few other places. There's masses of stuff produced by theists. There's only a tiny amount of stuff produced by naturalists. So in that sense, I guess we could always use more stuff written by naturalists.
Well, Graham, thank you so much for coming on the show, and best of luck to you and all your future work that you have coming up.
Thank you very much.
I'd like to thank Dr. Oppy for coming on the show. If you'd like to find out more about him or purchase any of his books, links are available in the description for this episode at godlesshaven.com. At godlesshaven.com, you can also find out more about the show, more about myself, and plenty of additional content. Music in the show is my own work. Thank you for listening, and please join me again in the not-too-distant future for another episode of Armchair Atheism.